Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I think we'll start going here. So we're Purepoint Uranium. We're an exploration company operating in northern Saskatchewan in the Athabasca Basin. We're home of the world's largest grade uranium deposits and mines right now. All of Canada's uranium actually comes out of this area. And what we're going to talk about today is a few things. We're going to start by just talking about the uranium landscape in general. It's a bit of a different market. It's smaller than people realize sometimes. It's not as transparent in terms of the pricing and how it operates as many would like. And we'll talk about some of the current political aspects of what's going on out there in the market and how it's affecting uranium prices and how uranium prices do move. Then we're going to talk a bit about where we are in the cycle. And we get asked a lot of different questions about what we do and about what other resource companies are doing in the basin, and we're going to talk about sort of the returns, the investor returns that we're seeing on work that we're doing in the basin. And then finally, we'll actually get around to talk about us and all the wonderful things we do and the projects that we're operating on, which is, as I mentioned, in the Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan. All of the orange projects you see there are our projects. There is a primary mine trend along the eastern side, but in recent years, there's been significant findings on the west side. We have two projects that are joint ventures with Cameco and Orano, which has helped us very well through the downturn of uranium, which we're now coming out of. It kind of kept us busy with things, but we actually started putting together this package some time ago during the last run in uranium, and as things sort of fell off, we were able to put a lot of our projects aside and wait for a better time, which I think we're in the middle of now. And during that time, we spent most of our efforts over on Hook Lake, where our partners were picking up most of the freight. So that worked out very well for us. So as far as the market, the uranium market goes, it's fairly small, relatively speaking, which means it's easy to muscle around with a little bit of money. We see a lot of drastic swings sometimes in uranium prices and in the equities that flow with them. But just to give you an idea of where it is, global demand for uranium is 62,000 tons of U3O8, which is what it takes to run the 440 reactors around the world, which has a value of about $7 billion, compared to coal, which is 8 billion tons of coal and a $600 billion market. So it's relatively small, but it still fuels 10% of the world's electricity. So it's an important fuel source. But from a price and a cost standpoint, it gives us a better indication as to why it's moving around the way it does. The other thing about uranium is that it's somewhat price inelastic. And that is to say, if the price of uranium doubles or triples, people don't buy less uranium. Because once you turn a reactor on, you're hard-pressed to shut it off if you run out of gas. And it only makes up about 10% of the cost of electricity. So the price of uranium can go up significantly, and it really doesn't affect the price of a kilowatt hour. And in this case, in the graph we're looking at here is just an indication of if you double the price of uranium, nuclear power would go up 9%, but if you double the price of gas, your costs are going up significantly. So the fact that the fuel is so efficient comes into play. The other thing, when we're looking at price, really the only publicly viewed price is typically the spot price people are looking for. And the problem with the spot price is it represents a small part of the uranium sales. So there isn't an exchange for this particular metal. So transactions that occur in the uranium space are specifically between a utility and a producer, and those agreements are made. And 85% of those are long-term contracts. So they will contract out the delivery of uranium over a 5-year period or a 10-year period. So, and because there is no exchange, and because there's not that many transactions in any given week, what we get is we can tell you roughly the spot price on a daily basis Long-term contracts we maybe figure out on a monthly basis. So it's not a, it makes for, people are always looking for the price of uranium, and it's not all that available. But the bigger thing that makes it unavailable is the fact that most of the long-term contracts are done off market. So when a utility goes to Cameco and sets up a contract, that price is never published. So most of the prices, we don't actually know what's going on. So right now, as we're looking at uranium prices, which are about $50 a pound, both long-term and the spot, what we're talking about is any of the contracts that were publicly put out to tender. So we kind of know what those prices are, and we can see what they are. But the $50, we know that is too low a price even now for a lot of these mines to come back online. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we do know that the likes of Cameco are writing contracts right now, and they're not writing them at $50. They're writing something north of $50. We just don't know what that price is. And the fact that they recently turned back on MacArthur, which is the largest, one of the largest mines in the world, means that they know they're getting more than $50 a pound for uranium. So, again, this industry is not very transparent, and when we are trying to figure out what it's doing from day to day, it's not all that evident. So what's going on with the uranium price? So back in 2011, what you're looking at here is the spot price of uranium since 2011. And the gray area represents the incentive price, which is the price that, by and large, your producers need to turn on a mine or to run a mine profitably, or to build a new mine. And what happened back in 2011 when the wave hit Fukushima, or hit Japan, they shut off all of the reactors in Japan. And Japan has about 10% of the world's reactors sitting on that island. So, but a lot of people equate the drop in uranium prices to Japan. And in fact, that's a bit of a red herring, because what really was going on behind the scenes is, since about 2005, Kazakhstan came into production. Back in 2000, they were not producing any uranium, and right now they produce about 40% of the world's uranium. So they actually were flooding the market with low-cost uranium, and on top of what everybody else was doing. And again, as I pointed out, because it's a small market, it doesn't take much to muscle it around. And so Fukushima was really kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And back at that time, we had an oversupply of uranium, and the price started to drop. And so as the price drops below incentive levels, we started to see mines being shut down and production being slowed down as we moved into today. And the other thing we saw happening was unplanned disruptions. So there was certain failures that were happening around the world in some of the big uranium mines. And then, of course, COVID hit back in 2020, and everything got shut down. And it took about 20 million pounds of uranium out of the market. And so during that time, we've just seen a significant reduction in the production of uranium. So as we try to rebalance this stuff, because we've got too much uranium sitting out there. So the result was this. This bar here represents the gap between what we're producing globally and what we are consuming globally. And so for the last 4 or 5 years, we've actually been producing 20 to 30% less uranium than we're using in reactors. And again, trying to put the supply and demand back into balance. And we're getting there. Now we've gotten to a point, and this is what we've seen in the last few years, last 2 years, where that balance seems to be coming back, and the price of uranium is now returning to or heading towards incentive levels. So 2 years ago, I think we were looking at $25 a pound uranium. Right now it's about $50. As I point out, we really need to get up to $65, $70 before new mines will be started to get built, or ones that are shut down get turned back on again. And so we're about halfway there. I think we're looking at another year or two of gradually increasing uranium prices. It's been moving a little differently in the last couple of years than we saw 15 years ago when the price of uranium took off. It was more of a hockey stick then. What we're seeing is just kind of this gradual rise over time. I'm not sure if anybody here owns any of Sprott's Physical Uranium Trust, which was, if you want to invest directly in the metal, it's pretty much the only thing you can put your hands on. And what they're doing is they buy physical uranium and store it. And so they're traded in Canada, and they represent the moving price of uranium. So there's been there's a lot of news lately, and what's been happening in the last certainly in the last 10, 15 years, but even more recently is nuclear power is being viewed very, very differently in the market than it was 10, 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, it was a danger and it was going to kill us, and now it is the newest green source of energy to move us into the future. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of countries now reversing their position on nuclear power. Australia has always had a moratorium against nuclear power, despite the fact that they have probably more reserves of uranium than anywhere else in the world. And so they're now putting through a bill to reverse that. Germany had a plan to shut down all of its reactors, which is now falling back on them as their oil and gas seems to be limited thanks to Russia. And so they've got 3 more that they haven't shut down. It looks like they'll be reversing their decision on that. We've seen Japan come back to the table, and they're getting ready to open up a lot more of their reactors and get them back online. Canada, we've done the same. California, Diablo Canyon, they're extending the life there. So, and this is all just in the last few months. So we are seeing this push and drive towards nuclear power as a source of electricity moving forward, and that only helps to hasten our return to good times in the uranium business. The second thing that we see happening in the last year is the need to secure self-sufficiency around power, and certainly the issues over in Europe right now with Russia has pointed that out. But right now, the United States has 25% of the world's reactors operating here, but currently the United States produces no uranium, and the lay of the land when it comes to nuclear is the countries that need it and that are using the most nuclear power are the ones that don't have the uranium, and the ones that do have the uranium aren't necessarily the ones building reactors. So where we've always tended to look at supply and demand of uranium on a global basis, it's now becoming a little more dangerous to do so. And there's a lot of efforts, certainly in the United States, to start shoring up that surety of supply. They're looking at a lot of new projects in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. They're looking for ways to really start getting a more secure source of uranium. Right now, I think the U.S. buys half of its uranium from Russia, Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan, and and nothing's disrupted at this point yet, but it certainly could if things get nastier than they have. The other thing, when we talk about Russia, we do get asked a lot about how is Russia, what's going on between Russia and Ukraine affecting nuclear power, and it isn't in a way that most people would think. What they're disrupting is more the whole fuel cycle. So Russia right now produces about 14% of the world's uranium. They use most of it themselves. But what they also do, between the time that we produce U-308 and it gets into a nuclear reactor, there's about a couple of years in there of conversion into fuel. So there's conversion, there's enrichment, reconversion. They turn it into fuel rods and pellets, and on it goes. That fabrication aspect is, Russia provides a lot of that aspect of it. So although they're providing 14% of the world's uranium, they do close to 40% of the world's enrichment. So all this U-308 is heading to Russia. they do those, they do the conversions and the enrichment, then they send it to whoever's ultimately buying it. Now again, there hasn't been any disruption in that yet, but every day the world is kind of looking for another way, a better way to slap Russia or vice versa, and this is where it would hit the industry, our industry. So there are a number of things underway right now to provide those sort of alternate capabilities. I know actually today Orano in France announced that they are starting to very quickly build more conversion facilities there as well. So these are the things that are happening now that we see are kind of bouncing our market around, and but only in a good way when it comes to the price of uranium. Did anybody have any questions about this before we move on? This is kind of, here we go.
Do you see them making any enrichment facilities domestically in the U.S. ever?
I haven't seen anything reported, but absolutely, absolutely. It is, uranium's on the strategic critical metals list, and there's a lot of money now being poured into ways of shoring up the supply. I mean, actually the Department of Defense sits on a lot of uranium, non-enriched. A lot of it's still in the ground, so they're looking at ways of kind of freeing that up. But yeah, I don't have any firsthand knowledge as to who's talking about it, but I can't imagine that those discussions aren't going on. Sure, it takes a while to actually turn a discovery into a mine, and so in terms of well, the reality is there is a lot of uranium around out there. We're not going to run out of uranium. It's how do we? It's the order in which we can get it moved out there. But there's a lot of new. There's a lot more demand right now for nuclear. So and it's coming from a few different places. There's a lot of discussion around the small modular reactors. I don't know if you've heard of any of that. I know in Canada we've got one going into commercial use in a few years. One of the first in the world. And it's just a smaller reactor, and it's good for, you could light up a town forever. You can use it in remote communities. You could do, but it's smaller, kinder, gentler, safer sort of thing. And so there's different ways of we're seeing different technologies that are going to be putting more demand on uranium in general. But it is a long cycle because it's high, as you imagine, it's highly regulated. From a safety standpoint, and I know in Canada, to the extent that if a mine is found, we sit next door to one of the biggest finds more recently with NextGen, and they found that 10 years ago, and they're probably 10 years away from mining. So it's a long cycle that could be managed. There's another question over here. Yeah. Well, what makes it cheaper? It's the mining method, and it's they use in situ leach methods of extracting it. So rather than digging a hole in the ground and mining it out, they actually will drill down into the ore body and put solvents into it, and it comes up on the other end. It's a less efficient way. You get less recovery, but it's far cheaper. So and that method is being used in various places as well. I know even up where we are, Denison has a project that they're developing, and that's the method that they're looking to use, and it's never been used up in northern Canada like that. Yes, so it was actually, yeah. So the United States actually had an arrangement with Russia for the demilitarization of weapons to recycle that uranium. Now they have to downgrade it because it's far more highly enriched. That deal came to an end in 2015. And so the Russians are not providing that into the market anymore. But there is secondary supply. It's just not as much as it used to be at all. So it's decreased a lot. You can refurbish fuel. I mean, when they take fuel out of a reactor, they've used a very small part of the energy that's contained in it. And there are methods of refreshing it and reusing it. But it's expensive. It's more expensive to some degree than pulling it out of the ground fresh again. But those secondary sources are squeezed up.
Could you talk just briefly about there was, I think it was Uranium 1 or something? It was where U.S.
Yeah, that was a bit of a a red herring too. I mean, it was a company called Strathmore. Was it Strathmore, Scott? Yeah. And what the Russians were buying was primarily Strathmore's holdings in Kazakhstan. The company just happened to have a few property projects here in the States, and that were closed. They weren't active projects, and in order for them to do the sale, they had to get certain approvals from the U.S. government, which they got. But at the end of the day, it's still here. They didn't pick up the property and take it over to Russia. They can't get anything out of it. They can't use it, work it, mine it, extract anything from it. So I mean, it's a bit of a nothing. But the primary impetus of that transaction was really the Russians buying into Kazakhstan projects. There we go. How do you like me so far? Okay. Oh, one more. There we go. Speaking in public. Yeah. Sorry, with regards to what? I think a lot of it is the transparency. A lot of it is where we don't have a nice gold price or oil price or things that we can follow and really understand the supply and demand aspects of it. So it I mean, if you've been following uranium, we've been yapping about it for the last 10 years that it's coming, like any time. Uranium's coming back, and we just don't know when. And so that's an issue in that there's no solid way. There hasn't been a really good way to really put any sort of predictions or plans in place until it actually happens. And when we see the long-term price of uranium, which we're looking at the long-term contracts because that's the real price. By the time we see it, it's the news that's a year old or what have you. So that's an issue. I think other than that, it's the only things that we worry about is another accident of some sort, because that just takes everybody out again. And we view these things very differently than the media would, per se. I mean, because nobody died at Fukushima, nobody died at 3 Mile Island. To us, those are successes because they were contained. Obviously, Chernobyl was a nightmare. But very quickly when you see it's too easy to make good panic news from the nuclear industry. I mean, we had a tsunami hit Japan, and all the news was about this reactor, when in fact everybody forgot to talk about the 20,000 people that just got washed out to sea. It was all about this reactor, because that's the scarier aspect of the story. So it's very easy for the story to turn on us. But again, a lot of that's been washed away, and that's the change in attitude towards nuclear, and people understand it more than they did. And we've seen, we saw in Ontario, they're extending the life of some of these reactors. So obviously, on the heels of that, we've got protesters who want it all shut down. But their arguments aren't as valid as they were 10, 15 years ago. They're not as scary because people understand it more than they did. And I think everyone's just getting a lot more comfortable with nuclear power and what it's good for and the safety aspects of it.